Paul?
Thank you, Bill. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us as the Soane Foundation brings together three eminent colleagues to share their insights on the interaction between architecture and the objects within. I'm Paul Whalen, chairman of the Sir John Soane's Museum Foundation, and on behalf of my fellow colleagues, my fellow trustees, it is my pleasure to introduce today's program. All of us at the Foundation truly appreciate that you share our passion for the Soanean world of art, architecture, and design. We are delighted that you're with us here today, and we invite you to join us for our remaining programs this spring and also for our annual gala, which we've just announced. The Soane Honors will take place on October 26th as we celebrate Madison Cox, landscape architect, and Scott Pask, stage set designer, with a festive evening in New York City. To learn more about the Soane Honors and all of the Foundation programs, please visit our website, sign up for our newsletter, and follow us on Instagram. Today, joining us from several continents, we have an impressive group of dear friends of the Soane Foundation who will dive deep into our season-long theme about the intersection between architecture and its contents, whether in a museum or in a residence. Barry Bergdoll is the Meyer Shapiro Professor of Art History at Columbia University, where he has been on the faculty since 1985. From 2007 to 2014, he was Chief Curator of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art. A passionate scholar of architecture and architectural history, Barry is joining us from Paris during his current sabbatical to help frame today's conversation, which he will introduce in a moment. Our presenters are Bruce Boucher, the Deborah Loeb Bryce Director of the Sir John Soane's Museum. He studied at Harvard University, Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, and at the Courtauld Institute of Art. Bruce taught for over 20 years at University College London before entering the museum world as curator and head of European Studies, Decorative Arts, and Ancient Art at the Art Institute of Chicago from 2002 to 2009. He is currently at work on a book about Sir John Soane as a collector and is joining us from London. Annabelle Selldorf is the principal of Selldorf Architects, which she founded in 1988. She serves as lead designer on each of the firm's projects and is currently at work on some of the most prestigious museum projects in New York and London. Annabelle is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and serves on the boards of the Architectural League of New York, the World Monuments Fund, the Chinati Foundation, and the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College. In 2016, she received the Medal of Honor from the American Institute of Architects New York chapter. Annabelle is joining us from New York. And now it is my pleasure to turn things over to Barry, who will begin the presentation and conversation. Welcome, Barry.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Bill. It's great to be even virtually back with the Soane, particularly as the extraordinary theme that's been worked on this past season is coming to the fruition of hearing today from someone who directs what we often think to be one of the most eccentric but enchanting museums on the face of the planet. Bruce Boucher, of course, from the Soane Foundation, from the Soane Museum, and Annabelle Selldorf, who is currently working on precisely the issue at hand today, which is how to move from a museum of the house type to a museum of the institutional type and back again, with her current work on moving the Frick collection into the Breuer building and back. If I could have the first image up, I want to just take you through a very quick photographic assembly of images that I hope will evoke two things for us. One, I hope it will give us a larger context to museum history, but I also want to a little bit muddy the distinction that might seem to dramatically leap before our eyes by these two views of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. It's almost impossible to imagine they're actually of the same institution, and they seem to come at the opposite ends of this great divide. On the one hand, Isabella Stewart Gardner's mansion with her extraordinary collection of objects, of furniture, of paintings, highly personal, and at the same time, in a sense, fixed, gelled into the vision that she left behind, the notion that somehow one should be as much in touch with the works of art and decorative arts that are there as they should be with the collector herself and her advisors. Renzo Piano's edition that you see there, completed in 2002, taken in this nighttime view in which we look into the idea of the modern museum as a neutral box in which objects can be encountered one by one without the distractions of the architecture, and in which they can be changed at will and moved around. So, as you will, personal versus impersonal, fixed versus permanent. I want to muddy the issue a little bit. I also want to introduce what my guests are going, my fellow panelists are going to speak about. Bruce Boucher will be taking us to the Soane, but he'll also be reminding us, at least in the background, that while Soane was creating his own house with its extremely inventive ways of exhibiting objects in a hybrid domestic and ultimately institutional setting, he was also creating what some have called the first purpose-built picture gallery in Britain, the Dulwich Picture Gallery. Next. And then Annabelle will take us a full century later to look at what's going on at the Frick collection. Of course, the Frick collection on the left, as it was finally installed from the House of Frick, reworked by the architect John Russell Pope in the 1930s and opened to the public. Its collection, of course, moved to, it's not the collection, of course, that you see there, but moved to Breuer's great loft spaces of the Whitney Museum from the middle of the 1960s, a place for changeable display and an encounter in institutional setting. But I just want to look very quickly with you at a couple of more images. Next, please. It will take us on a brief history of what we might call these two typologies, the house versus the institution, but muddy the issue as we enter into it to think about how objects are related to space, to decor, to setting, and of course, setting will include color and lighting. Here we are at the origins of the museum in the 18th century, almost simultaneously, these two great classical buildings. On the left, the Villa Albani, where that great art historian, father figure of art history, Winkelmann, was cataloging the antiquities and the sculptures of Alessandro Albani, the nephew of Pope Clement the 11th, in this purpose-built villa, which had gallery spaces from the beginning and was open in a limited way to visitors. And almost at the same time, on the right, what some think to be the first public art museum, the Museum Friedrichianum for Landgrave Frederick II of Hessen in Kassel, designed as a museum, but not that we think that here we are completely free of the residents. There was attached to it residential quarters for the Landgrave, so that one was in the presence of the collector, even if the galleries were purposely built for changing displays of his possessions. Could have the next, please. The issue with the French Revolution, which of course is a threshold moment for the invention of the public museum, for the admission of the public to what had been formerly private holdings or royal holdings. I just evoke here two simultaneous considerations, both of them in retrofits of existing buildings. On the left, a monastery turned into a museum of French monuments by Alexandre Lenoir in the 1790s. And then on the right, some of the earliest projects by the architects Percier and Fontaine, so often evoked at the Soane Foundation, to transform the Louvre Palace into the Louvre Museum. But you can see in both of these settings, the deliberate attempt through architectural means to create an atmosphere for the appreciation of the works of art. Lenoir wants to take us back to the specific atmosphere here of the 13th century. He also wants us to relate the objects that are in the room to one another because they belong to the atmosphere of this time, as well as its lighting and colored conditions. Percier and Fontaine wanted to transport us to antiquity, even as they create a very present decor. Could we have the next, please? Soane is not the only architect of the opening decades of the 19th century who would conceive both a private display and a public display almost simultaneously. Soane on Lincoln's Inn Fields, Soane at Dulwich. But here, Carl Friedrich Schinkel, the great Prussian architect, building for William von Humboldt, the family house Schloss Tegel on the edge of Berlin, on the left, a residence, but also a place to hold the great collections we'll see in a moment, of the Humboldt family, which continued to grow and were open selectively to the public, even as Wilhelm von Humboldt was a key figure behind the creation of a housing for the former royal collections in Schinkel's purpose-built Neues Museum today, Altes Museum on the right with its great Greek stoa. Next, please. Let's just have a quick look here at how the antiquities and the collections were displayed, integrated into the decor with the furniture. Hard to distinguish between what was a object for daily use and what was an object for beholding in these display of statuary in one of the gallery rooms, but it also doubled as a living quarters for the Humboldt family. You notice here the dimensions are rather small, so Schinkel devised these bases that could twist and turn so that one could admire a sculpture from all directions, even a confined space. But this faux marbling, this incorporation of objects into decor, are we to think of Humboldt, or are we to think of the Schinkel, or are we to have some kind of detached experience of the antique object? Next, please. Even in the museum, which was thrown open to the public in 1830, interestingly first exhibited as an empty building that it might be appreciated as architecture, and then opened a few weeks later with the works installed, Schinkel thought that the works of art would be literally incorporated into the architecture. Not only the statuary in the great central rotunda, evoking the Pantheon, which would be a fixed setting, but even as you can see here I don't know if my arrow works, this creation of special panels for the paintings that would change in style with the history of art, and below on the ground floor, the statuary set in a neo-antique setting. Could we have the next, please? Of course, this is a commemoration of a great public museum we mustn't forget, the Vatican Museum's being opened here, the Rotunda, with its statuary in Rome as a public museum. And the next, please. Barrel on to my very last example to get you thinking about the topic in more general terms, some of the questions I want to us all to bring into the discussion, and I hope you will elaborate on them in the Q&A box at the end, on the bottom here. The last slide I want to show you is this, Ludwig von Klenze, the Bavarian, in service to the Bavarian crown, the German architect who would work on numerous museums. Here I evoke the Glyptothek in Munich. Some of you might know it as it was restored after Second World War bombing on the right to a modern museum in which all of the decor that you see on the left, the colorful decor, the very emphatic presence of an architecture to create the ambience and the setting and the context for thinking about classical sculpture that had been collected by Ludwig I of Bavaria. All of that after 1950 stripped away to create a more neutral setting. Some of von Klenze's coloring here in his projects on the left. I have boycotted Russia in this presentation, so I will not take you with Klenze to the Hermitage, but that is perhaps the apotheosis of this notion of a museum as a colorful setting for the works of art rather than a neutral background that should disappear from our consciousness. And with that, I'm going to turn over these issues and these thoughts to those who are able best to guide us in very specific examples, to my friend and colleague, Bruce Boucher, who will take us to Lincoln's Inn Fields.
Thank you, Barry. That was a real tour de force. Good evening or good afternoon, everyone. Many of you know that visiting Sir John Soane's museum is like stepping into the mind of a late 18th century architect, as well as being something of a voyage into the sublime. The house and its contents hover between a Renaissance cabinet of curiosities and the Enlightened Museum, where objects are classified according to genres and chronology. In his privately printed description of the house and museum, John Soane laconically observed that everything was arranged, as he put it, as studies for my own mind. Yet he never divulged what he meant by that, leaving it to others to draw their own conclusions. Today, I'd like to focus on a few examples of the display within the museum and how it changed in Soane's lifetime, as well as what it tells us about the associations these works created in Soane's mind. May we have the next, please? The next, thank you. Towards the end of his life, Soane wrote that had he been able to build his house and museum as a unity rather than piecemeal, it would have looked different. And he quoted the Abbé Logier on the plan of a building as manifesting the genius of its creator. And here we can see just such a contrast in these two images. On the left, an idea that Soane mooted in 1810 to combine number 12, the first of his houses on Lincoln's Inn Field, and number 13, the one that he moved into in 1813, into a grid-like pattern on the ground floor with a sequence of rooms designated for a library, plaster cast, as well as galleries, including one specifically for prints and drawings. Presumably, Soane and his family would have lived on the floor above. This didn't happen, of course, for a variety of reasons. And Soane's project evolved over decades and included 3 terrace houses, adjacent terrace houses on the north side of Lincoln's Inn Field. And as we can see in the plan on the right, Soane did make a distinction, initially at least, between the house, which is at the bottom of the slide, and the galleries which run across the top of the image. The galleries initially were confined to the yard or stable area behind all 3 buildings that he acquired between 1792 and 1822. Soane's ingenuity, however, was manifested in how he exploited space. As for example, you'll note that the boundary wall between number 12 and 13 is an obtuse angle. And this enabled him to carve out on the landings of the staircase small pockets of space, which became the Shakespeare and Tivoli recesses. The next, please. Fortunately, and here we are looking at the Tivoli recess which was restored in the 1990s, and you can see how it is a small space just off the landing, and directly below it is the area which is the Shakespeare recess, a kind of shrine to William Shakespeare. The next, please. Fortunately, there is visual documentation of how the Tivoli recess changed across 5 years. The print on the left of 1830 is by Soane's office, and it shows that the area was originally intended as a shrine to John Soane himself, directly above that to William Shakespeare. Thus one sees his bust on the monopodium on the left, framed by his Royal Academy diplomas as an associate and full academician, and the prize-winning designs that advanced his career in the Royal Academy schools. All of this is presided over by the bust of his mentor, George Dance, which we see on the cabinet to the right. After Soane's bill to turn the house and collection into a national museum was passed by Parliament in 1833, he placed his bust in the center of the dome area and refashioned the Tivoli recess as a gallery of contemporary British sculpture by fellow academicians. And this we can see looking into it in the image on the right. The next, please. I mentioned earlier that Soane converted the yard behind his house into a suite of galleries. And this image shows what they look like from the second floor of the house. To the lower left, at the bottom left, you can see the lantern of the breakfast room and the skylights flanking its central dome, as well to the left of the skylights, the adjacent skylight of the lobby room, which leads to the dome area, which is a very tall conical lantern that we see on the upper left. Behind that is another lantern with amber-colored glass, which is behind the plaster cast of the Apollo Belvedere. To the right of the dome are the skylights of the drawing office, which was built in 1824. And further along, if we could see them, is the lantern of the picture room, which was also under construction at the same time. And as Barry mentioned, it's worth noting that Soane was grappling with these top-lit galleries just as he was designing Dulwich Picture Gallery between 1811 and 1812. So there's obviously an overlap between the freestanding Dulwich galleries and what was effectively a series of galleries that were stood back from the house proper. The next slide, please. One key to understanding Soane's approach to display and to the symbolic language behind many of the fragments and sculptures in his collection can be found in the theoretical writings of the Frenchman Pierre Hugues, the self-styled Baron d'Ancqueville, who passed a number of years in London cataloging the collection of classical sculpture owned by Charles Townley, which was eventually given to the British Museum in 1805. And here we are looking on the left at the frontispiece of Soane's copy of this work, which exists in 3 volumes, and on the right, an image of one of the illustrations, this notably the sacred bull, which appears in many ancient religions, and above it coins which were part of the iconography of a monotheistic culture that's d'Ancqueville believed existed between East and West in the ancient world, and that you could find proof of this in the migration of images. And on the image of the mystic bull, you can just notice perhaps Soane's handwriting, where he refers to page 429. He copied very large chunks of d'Ancqueville's writings in preparation for his lectures as professor of architecture at the Royal Academy. And he did take these ideas, which were rather abstruse, very seriously. And the next, please. One can see this in the way that he puts together fragments, say, for example, here in his study in the house, which where he's created a fireplace out of Roman spolia, in which vegetable forms and swags recur in various different forms. Opposite this, on the window on the other side, are a series of marble lion's paws which festoon the window, and which he admired for their carving. And more often than not, it seems to have been the idea behind the objects, their connections and associations in Soane's mind that mattered to him. Next, please. And another example of the migration of works within Soane's display, the way in which he created a kind of visual opportunism, can be seen in the Egyptian capital of black marble that Soane purchased from the estate of Robert Adam in 1818. After his purchase of the sarcophagus of the Egyptian pharaoh Seti I in 1824, Soane grouped a series of related works in the crypt behind his house, as can be seen in this engraving on the left from John Britton's discursive account of Soane's house and collection called The Union of Architecture, Sculpture, and Painting, which was published in 1827. The capital you can just see on the right behind the sarcophagus, while on the left there's a plaster bust of a pharaonic head, which he acquired from another English collector. The slide on the right shows where Soane later rehung the capital in the museum corridor, just outside the picture room, wedging it in to a sequence between a fragment of a ceiling rosette and a plaster cast of a capital of the Temple of Vesta at Tivoli, one of his favorite classical motifs. Could we have the next slide, please? It may be easier to see the way these vegetable motifs stack up in this computer-generated image of the west wall of the museum corridor. And it does appear to suggest the way in which he grouped images, fragments, according to associations, typologies. And you can see here also the fragment of the frieze of the Temple of Vesta of Tivoli with the bull's head, and then on the other side, another fragment of a bucrania as well. The way in which Soane stacks these images up, particularly from different cultures, the next please, invites comparison with his famous pasticcio in the Monument Court, which was created in 1819 and then taken down in the 1890s and then recreated or restored in 2004. And here we see a Roman altar as the base, surmounted by 2 capitals and a finial. The lower capital was believed by Soane to be Hindu, although we know now that it's actually Moroccan from the Sadian dynasty. The one above it, again, is now a plaster cast of, or replica of, a Roman capital. In other words, it's a visual analog of the migration of symbols across Eastern and Western ancient cultures. The next, please. There appears to be a similar process at work in the setting of vases in the library dining room. Here we're looking at a large Apulian volute crater in the center, flanked by marble vases from Italy, and the group is closed by two Chinese Celadon 18th century vases, which had previously been in the monk's parlor. Again, the governing principle appears to be the association of similar forms across cultures and time. And this also is suggested by the fact that the vases are flanked by two curvilinear pieces of a tree that had been struck by lightning. Soane tells us this, and he put them up, I think, to suggest the idea that art is imitating forms that were found in nature. The next slide, please. And Soane often set his pupils to copy Greek vases, as we can see here, with simpler fictile vessels that came from medieval cultures as a form of comparative studies in the silhouettes of these objects. So in other words, a kind of aesthetic as well as a historical study. And finally, the next slide, please. I want to consider a late addition to Soane's museum, the picture room, which opened in 1824. It is, as many of you probably know, the aha moment of every visit and never fails to delight, thanks to the movable picture panels, which we can see in operation in this watercolor by his amanuensis, Joseph Michael Gandy. Here, Soane was adopting an established model for viewing multiple works of art, which had been introduced by George Dance in his Shakespeare Gallery in Pall Mall in the 1790s, and was employed in various commercial and private galleries thereafter in London. The room itself surprises the visitor by its burst of color and light, the richness of its appointments, oak-lined with mahogany, ebony, and brass, and topped by a ceiling, which you can see here, embellished by what Soane termed arched canopies, which are a fusion of elements drawn from classical and Gothic architecture, a mixture of classical and Gothic, which is also echoed on the marble fireplace. The next slide, please. And here you can see the fireplace, which is flanked by two of the four Anglo-Indian ivory chairs, which Soane put here in 1824, and we've recently reinstated. And I'm juxtaposing the view of the picture room on the left with a view of the main east wall of the great room of the Royal Academy in Somerset House in a drawing by Thomas Sandby, who was Soane's predecessor as the Royal Academy's professor of architecture. Sandby in 1792 is showing a proposed hang of paintings for the Academy's summer exhibition of that year. And the comparison reminds us that Soane's approach to his own gallery was guided by that of the Academy, on whose exhibition committee he sometimes served. So if every portrait can be said to be a portrait of the artist, then Sir John Soane's museum is definitely a portrait of its creator. Here he strove to follow the example of Sir John Vanbrugh, as in the words of Sir Joshua Reynolds, an architect who composed like a painter. He blended architecture, art, color, and light to produce the variety, intricacy, and movement he found lacking in so much contemporary architecture. And it remains today his greatest achievement. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to a modern great architect, Annabelle Selldorf.
Well, thank you very much. This was fascinating, and obviously many thoughts come to mind. By contrast, we're now going to talk about the Frick collection on 70th and 71st Street and Fifth Avenue. As you probably know, the building was originally built as a private residence by Thomas Hastings of Carrere and Hastings, and it was completed in 1914. Henry Clay Frick had all but 5 years to enjoy this grand mansion that he had commissioned alongside of many, many paintings, decorative art objects, and an expansive idea about ideas of living in the early 20th century. So next. I wanted to show a couple of pictures of when the mansion was under construction. Needless to say, this is an extraordinary image showing you the West Gallery as it is today, just removing some of the decorative or the finishing elements rather. And again, remarkably, this gallery was built for the original house. And next. So very quickly, a history of the Frick building. It starts in 1914 as the original residence for Henry Clay Frick and his family. In 1924, at the behest of his daughter Helen, Frick commissioned a library building that you can sort of see all the way to the top of the page. And following his death, or rather his wife's death, John Russell Pope was commissioned to turn the private house into a museum. Frick had always thought of the house becoming a museum, but in 1935 it was already clear that certain modifications were necessary in order to make the museum accessible to the public. And I think this is a very important thing to consider because now the house became open to people other than the family and friends and the board of trustees. So then moving forward in 1941, there was an addition. Here you can see that, actually you have to go back one more, sorry. All these additions amount to something that leaves the Frick and the Frick Museum and the library as a freestanding building or quasi-freestanding building with a garden to the north. When we were hired some 5-6 years ago, please go on to the next, we were asked to open the second floor, the private quarters of the mansion, to the public. And surely if you're anything like me, you've stood there and wondered what the second floor looks like. We've expanded, or we're proposing to expand the lobby so that the entire museum is accessible, and we're building under the existing garden, which always was a roof garden, a new auditorium, and adding to the library a series of spaces that will enable the museum to function with a conservation studio and some public spaces for study, education, and even a small cafe. And next. Here is the image that I talked about. You will surely have stood there and thought, what is it like to understand what the private quarters of the family looked like, knowing that the decorative arts that inform the spaces on the ground floor, together with the phenomenal painting collection, is something that is so very specific. You're also looking at a grand organ that Clay installed here that unfortunately hasn't functioned in many, many years. Next. This is the West Gallery that you saw earlier in the construction images. There was a very clear idea here by Hastings at the time, how to create a kind of day-lit, flooded experience of this large gallery to display the significant collection that Klee had assembled. And next. Frick had assembled, sorry. And here is the famous living room with paintings by Holbein, El Greco, and many other phenomenal pieces of decorative art. And I think it's for every visitor always been an amazing experience to be able to come up close to both furniture and art objects in a domestic setting. Having said that, one also knows that this is a quasi domestic setting, unlike the Soane house. What we see here is a curated experience. Next. And here is the room with the famous Fragonard paintings, again looking out on the garden that is set back from Fifth Avenue. And next. And here another picture of when John Russell Pope became involved with turning the Hastings building into a museum and library. And to me, this is a fascinating image, because what you see here is also a tall building to the sort of right hand behind the West Gallery that was another mansion that had been removed in the 40s, as I mentioned. And next. And here is a view of the garden court that's being filled in with skylights and the like, again, part and parcel of turning a private mansion that had a porte cochere going north-south in between the blocks into a public space. Next. And here it is with the skylight nearly finished. It's marvelous to look down on the museum and see the kind of meandering skylights that in a very particular way give a dynamic and a temporary what's the best way, a dynamic experience of daylight in the belly of a big museum. And next. And here a picture of the original living room. The pictures hung more or less in the way in which visitors got to experience them, with the famous Bellini painting in the middle, and many of the decorative arts, pieces of furniture being exhibited exactly like this through the last more or less 100 years. And next. And here is a rendering just to show that the mansion will remain practically unaltered, albeit with restored skylights. We're making the main entrance hall accessible with a ramp that you can see on your right. The reception hall is being altered just a little bit by lifting a kind of greenhouse structure, as it were, on the second floor, so as to connect the mansion to the remainder of the building. Circulation and connectivity is really what this project is all about, adding merely 10,000 square feet to the volume of the building, but with that enabling a comprehensive improvement of the visitor experience and adding education space, a small cafe, etc., etc. And next. And here is the new special exhibitions gallery, which will connect to the East Gallery, so that thematically related exhibitions are easily possible. That was one of the spatial conditions of the previous museum that was lacking. There was no special exhibition spaces. Education spaces in the basement had been utilized, but no significant exhibitions could ever be held without moving the permanent collection. And this is, of course, a really very important and useful thing. And so next, at a glance, I just want to give you an impression that the majority of the work in the museum leaves the mansion and all the existing spaces alone. In plan here in orange, you can see special exhibitions, and we're very excited to utilize spaces to the north of the Russell Page Garden from 1977, education, classrooms and education spaces that were always part and parcel of the mission for the Frick collection, but had never theretofore been able to really find a proper home, and had to always take place in the galleries. So this is very exciting. And next. And on the second floor, all that, which is the sort of yellow, golden colored space, are going to be new galleries in the previous private quarters of the Frick family, and a series of operational spaces, connection to the library, conference rooms, the cafe, and museum shop, connecting all of the public spaces in a much more easy and harmonious way. And next. And so here is again a photograph of the famous living room with that Bellini painting, an enlarged picture of it you see here on the right, which gives us a transition, I think. Next. To the Breuer building, now currently called Frick Madison, previously called the Whitney Museum. You're all familiar with the Marcel Breuer design building that once the Whitney left to move downtown, was handed over to the Metropolitan Museum, who after a period of renovation and staging wonderful exhibitions, decided that they should rather stay in the building on 86th Street, and was became a sublet situation for the Frick. This was really fantastic because it made it possible for paintings and decorative arts to be seen while the mansion is undergoing the renovation and addition. And I was very happy that we were asked to contribute to the layout to exhibit the works of art in this building. You may imagine that a brutalist building, as I said, by Marcel Breuer from the 60s, is a difficult counterpoint to an old master collection. But we felt ultimately that this was a real opportunity, as Barry so eloquently said, to take a building from a house to an institution, and eventually we'll take it back to the house. But it also is proof that the architecture here was a great collaborator. And next. For example, here is that same Bellini painting in a space that we arranged to be almost like a chapel. And it's, of course, interesting to see how the painting emanates tremendous tremendous atmosphere, despite the fact that it is in this brutalist, very different context, looking out the window, seeing a 1960s apartment building. Next. And here is the series of Fragonard paintings, again in the context to the architecture, creating a really interesting juxtaposition, but also a very specific circumstance in which people can now experience the collection in a much more isolated, much more institutionalized setting. The curatorial attitude here was to make the collection, to display the collection in a more traditional museal context, where they are organized by country and by age. And next. We were able to make arrangements also for decorative arts that are seen here very differently, not in traditional spaces, not with a domestic furniture layout, but rather as museal objects, and therefore create a very strong contrast to the sort of willful, eccentric, and highly personal exhibition that you can see, for example, in the Soane, as Bruce Boucher already explained so well. And next. A focus on the individual objects and a sort of different and very direct interaction between sculpture, decorative arts, and paintings in this context is really a juxtaposition to what it will be when the collection returns to the museum. And this is my last image. I hope everybody will turn on their camera again, and we can move to a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you both, Annabelle and Bruce. I think there's enough in here for an entire season of these Soane encounters. I'm just going to maybe pick up on a few words that recurred and ask some questions about them. And then because our time is short, I hope people will be typing in questions also into the Q&A. I know there's some already. And we'll be picking those up, and I'll be folding them into our discussion. So the audience, although we won't hear them, will be part of our conversation. So I was, of course, the image of the Bellini in its chapel-like setting under a brutalist ceiling is so captivating. We could have just decided that we were going to discuss that for the entire hour. But I think it reminds us that, of course, that object was never created in the with the concept that it would ever live in a museum. And so whether it is represented as either a precious work of art, or depending on your point of view, maybe Marxists would say a capitalist trophy in Henry Clay Frick's mansion, or whether you have rather brilliantly created in a kind of minimalist nod to Lenoir and his Museum of French Monuments, an atmosphere for trying to reconstitute something of the religiosity of an image that was created for an ecclesiastical setting. I think we're reminded as we look at on both sides of this divide that all of these objects have been recontextualized, whether they're contextualized in the modern museum, or whether they're contextualized in the house museum. So I don't know if either of you have thought specifically just on that observation. I love to hear them. What is the status of the object? Is there ever any such thing as the creation of a pure encounter with an object in these architectural settings, whether they're as dense and crowded as a Soanian interior, or whether they're as stripped down and minimalist as Annabelle Selldorf putting Bellini in Breuer.
But don't you think that in the House Museum, in Soane's installation, he doesn't isolate the objects. He rather brings them together. And I think that Bruce's photo of the pasticcio is really fascinating because he also appropriates the items and turns them into, if you will, a new work of art.
Yes, I think the word recontextualizing is an important one here, because what Soane's doing, what actually in the 18th century in Rome at the Villa Medici and elsewhere, and even in the 16th century in the Palazzo della Valle, this idea of taking reliefs, inscriptions, immuring them in the walls of a building is trying to recontextualize antiquity. And by bringing things together which never existed in the same place in their own time, you deracinate them, but also it forms the basis for creating, making them interlocutors with each other in a different way. And I think that's what Soane was trying to do.
Well, there are also fragments, which I think is a really relevant aspect of it. They are deracinated by virtue of the fact that it's a piece of a whole that has been taken from one place to another and juxtaposed to something altogether different.
Yeah, and in fact, I think for Soane it was an aesthetic experience, and that's why his descriptions, his privately printed guidebooks, are rather disappointing because they don't say a great deal other than to comment on the effects of light and shade, or talk about the provenance of a work of art. I suspect if he were alive, if you had been there in his time, it would have been like performance art. He would have explained things, he would have drawn attention to one thing or another, and maybe told a story about how he acquired it, or what he saw when he was in Rome as a student in 1778, 1779. And I think one of the problems with turning that, and it's analogous, I suppose, with the Frick, turning what was essentially a private experience into a public museum, is the fact that he didn't really think of it in terms of the next stages. How do you make it accessible to the public? And in the 19th century, there were quite a lot of criticisms of the fact that you could go there, but you felt like you were in a private house, and so you didn't dare ask to see that cabinet opened or to ask for a particular book or something like that, because it was like going into a private house. And a lot of the changes that happened in the 19th century, taking works of art off, moving them into different places, was an attempt to make them more accessible, particularly before electric light made it all more visible.
I'm fascinated, Bruce, by, as you were speaking, thinking to what extent, obviously, Soane is completely absorbed in the 18th century notion of the association of ideas, and with it somehow, so that the assemblage is as much, I think, very self-consciously for him, a work of art in and of itself as the individual objects. And of course, the great problem was the association of ideas, somehow based on a philosophical notion that we're all alike, and that we will be able to recreate these associations of ideas, and that they can, as you explain, that they can somehow come alive for us as they did for Soane while he was organizing things on his walls or in his deep recesses and the like. I showed Schinkel at the very beginning, and of course Schinkel was completely baffled by Soane's museum. But what we he much preferred the way that John Nash laid out things in a very orderly fashion in his display of architectural models. And of course, the museum that I showed very briefly at the beginning by Schinkel was very highly organized, with the notion that chronology, which was in itself a new idea, that works of art would be shown chronologically rather than by themes or by association of ideas, that would become the framework, a kind of supposedly neutral framework of chronology. I wonder, do we have any evidence of what Soane would have thought of the emerging new museums, be it the National Gallery, the British Museum, other institutions?
I don't think so, because when he was creating his house museum, there were a number of other house museums in London, and the British Museum and the National Gallery were both originally house museums. The National Gallery opened in John Julius Angerstein's house on Pall Mall, and it was rather analogous to Soane's picture room. And in fact, they opened the same year, and I think the picture room was his riposte to people criticizing the fact that the National Gallery was so shabby compared to the Louvre, by saying that, well, with these panels, you can get 3 times as many works of art into a relatively small space, 17 by 11 by 13 feet. And the British Museum also was in Monmouth House still at that time. And when the Townley collection was added to it in 1805, it was an extension which was treated like a private house, essentially just a series of top-lit galleries. And it was only in the 1837, the National Gallery moved into Trafalgar Square. In the 1840s, Smirke created the great neoclassical temple facade for the British Museum. So that was long after his day. So although it seems eccentric to us now, in Soane's day, there wasn't really in England something like the Castle or the Glyptothek in Munich, or indeed the Louvre.
I'm very mindful of the time. We just hit the hour. Some people probably are going to have a sandwich while they listen to us, but I think we need to go a little bit further because there's some really fantastic questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to give us a few of those to discuss for a moment. One is directed directly to Annabelle. She says, your new gallery's upstairs at the Frick, and there's a lot of curiosity about going up that staircase, appearing already in the Q&A. The question is, your gallery's upstairs at the Frick contains some minimal classical detailing. How did you decide how far to take the classical detailing? The over doors with classical brackets are fairly literal, for instance, but other elements are very abstract. What guided your decision-making? So that, maybe if you could just fill us in a little bit about that. And also, are the sizes of the new display rooms upstairs related to the rooms originally there? Of course, the ceilings are actually quite low on that second floor. Or did you just work, Annabelle, with the exterior windows to determine the size of the rooms? Are there rooms all to be used for exhibitions currently unknown, or for specific images?
Whoa.
That's a lot in those questions.
Whoa,
yeah.
whoa.
But take us upstairs. I think one of the intriguing things is, of course, neither of these places that we're talking about today, Soane or Frick, are private houses that suddenly were thrown open to the public. Both of their creators were thinking of this as admitting a future public. So they're already hybrid in a way. But
I think that's a really very
about
important. It feels like that's a quintessential theme. Having said that, the Boucher room that was Frick's wife's boudoir, that was always on the second floor, was taken to the ground floor when it was turned into a museum, and we're bringing it back upstairs to the former location. In fact, Xavier Solomon has made a beautiful YouTube video that is very worth watching, where he describes what is being done. It's important to understand that the collection has grown significantly since the early days. And so the second floor is going to provide an opportunity to show both decorative arts as well as drawings and paintings. And yes, we are trying to keep a logical layout as much as possible, relating to the original layout. But you're not going to see bedrooms. It's not, we just couldn't find Henry Clay Frick's bed again. No, because, and I think this is really very important. First of all, it hasn't been a house in a very, very long time. But secondly, I think it would, it bears elaborating on how a house becomes a museum, even if it is a house museum relating to domestic scale and furniture and things like that. So further to the detail, we've really tried to maintain continuity with the existing mansion, both with Hastings' detail as well as John Russell Pope's detail, but there are areas where the addition is taking place, where differences occur, and we felt that it was important to articulate a sort of simple aesthetic that is contemporary. One journalist at one point or another wrote about our edition and said that I am no John Russell Pope, and I will agree with that. I'm not that. Having said that, we really did study scale, proportion, lighting, and are working hard at creating something that is sympathetic and coherent and continuous in terms of material and overall experience, always bearing the experience of the visitor in mind, which is something that I in turn have a question about, because if we think about visitors in the 19th century, who were they? Who were the people that came to the Soane Museum?
Well, oddly enough, one of them was Gustav Whalen, who was the great organizing genius behind the Neues, now Altes Museum. And he described it as an example of English whimsy. He thought that it's a sort of combination of things that you would only see in a feverish dream. And I think the problem, which Barry touched on earlier, is that while Soane was building up his collection and also taking leave of it in 1837, the approach to museums had changed enormously. And it was, chronology. It was, Greek, Roman, Asian, so on and so forth. And the way Soane mixed ancient and modern was baffling to, I think, professional museologists in the 19th century. And Adolf Michaelis, in 1882, who's another German archaeologist, was incensed by it and said it was like, all the collection of a secondhand clothes dealer stuffed into a doll's house. So it was, and in fact, in the early 20th century, there was a parliamentary committee which tried to persuade the trustees to change everything in the Soane and have vitrines, display cases, make it much more like a modern museum. And of course, they resisted this, and then World War II came. And I think in some ways, people thought, or fashion has caught up with John Soane now, that people are glad that he didn't change, that it wasn't changed into yet another museum, and that it represented a different kind of, how would you say, configuration of works of art to reach a different conclusion from the one that, say, Gustav Whalen or Adolf Michaelis would have reached.
There's a very intriguing and maybe somewhat tough question for all of us. Came from one audience member. The House Museum of Donald Judd, now we don't have images of that, but we count on everyone having an image of Donald Judd in their mind. The House Museum of Donald Judd in Marfa moves the discussion of objects in a context to a notion of our appreciation of the space, quotes, between the object and the observer. This connects to what you were just speaking about, Annabelle. Is that understanding of the location of the observer relative to what is being observed consequential to Soane? So I think we start with Soane here, but I think it is interesting to what extent the extraordinary spaces of Soane also were, I interpret this question to me, to what extent were they related to position of the the viewer moving through?
No,
You want me to repeat?
it's a great question. And I would say yes, because what Soane is trying to do is to create a kind of mood journey throughout the building. He was very much influenced by what's his name, Le Musier, the 18th century French Casas.
Le Camus, Le Camus, yeah.
Who said, that architecture shouldn't be neutral; it should move us. And Soane wanted that, and of course that's why he uses colored skylights, colored glass, stained glass too, where you go from large to small rooms through passageways. The sort of things that Schinkel didn't like. He thought they were deceptions, but it was in order to make it, but he didn't want it to be a neutral experience. And I think that's what he set out to do, and that's what he did. Although it's not to everybody's taste, and people sometimes in the olden days would get lost in it.
But Schinkel didn't exactly apply neutral space either, right? I thought that example that you showed of the Altes Museum is really incredibly interesting. I dare say there is no such thing as neutral space.
Yes.
And to the extent that this question is important for consideration is the fact that it's impossible for a person to see a work of art away from the context in which you are seeing it, both material and spatial, but also psychologically, right? I mean, our memory is definitely linked to space, time, and space and time, and anybody who has seen an exhibition in more than one place will, like, and I remember distinctly seeing an Agnes Martin show in London, and then seeing the same show in New York, and it was like two different worlds. My memories and sentiments about the artist's work were completely different and influenced by the hanging, by the atmosphere, maybe by other visitors that were surrounding me. And I've always thought that that's a very interesting aspect of museums and curated space.
I think it's a really important point that we didn't come up with, but it is already suggested by maybe by the Judd question. I mean, the Judd question already invites us to think about the space as is present, as the works that are in the space, but we haven't so much talked about sequence. And I thought that was one thing that was really fascinating. If we'd had an hour to play with the two images of Soane thinking of working with the existing buildings, and Soane thinking how could he make a set of amphithéâtres as though he was Robert Adam redesigning the space. Very Adam-esque what he wants to do there. But in any case, this whole question of sequence, of what you see and in what order, and to what extent some kind of axis or enfilade wants us to see something beyond, all of that kind of staging, I think we haven't been able to talk about so much. And I agree with you, Annabelle, there's nothing neutral at all about Schinkel's spaces. It's absolutely a journey. It's a journey to a kind of enlightenment in which the whole staircase sequence is absolutely key to it. But also key to it, which is very frequently misunderstood, is the rotunda at the center of the Schinkel plan does not connect to the other spaces. It is actually deliberately set, it is pushed off axis so that you can see through it only in one direction. His idea was it doesn't connect to the galleries in an obvious way. And the reason was he thought of it as a sanctuary into which you would go first, and you would collect your thoughts, your sentiments, your sort of state of mind in order to prepare yourself to be in the state of mind for looking at, thinking about, and discussing works of art. So that this sort of sense of buffer spaces and transition into is something that Schinkel was very aware of, and this notion that the space of viewing works of art is not the space, it's not quotidian space of sort of daily.
But what's fascinating is that what Soane and Schinkel share is that they make the works of art work for their own utilization of space and light, as it were. Whereas at a later date, or maybe roughly contemporaneously, there is another way that says you are in a building, which is why the demand for neutral space has come about, perhaps, is where the architecture is secondary to the experience, the chronology, or the information that the art provides. And somehow, I don't think that you can ever adequately separate one from the other. But anyway, that's a much longer conversation.
Great. I think we've reached one of those points in these conversations where we have two choices. We say everybody cancel your afternoon plans if you're in New York, your evening plans if you're in Europe, and we're going to continue this amazing conversation. Or we say, as in the best of programs, we've really opened up a lot of questions that I think all of us, including the panelists, can continue to think about. And for that, we're grateful to Paul and Bill and to the Sir John Soane's Museum Foundation for having staged this event.
Thank you, Barry, Bruce, and Annabelle. This has been a fascinating discussion on architectural context for the presentation of historical collections. Really fantastic. And Barry, I think you're right that the discussions engendered enough ideas for an entire lecture season here at the Soane Foundation. We'll see if we can pull this out. We're always in touch with you, of course. So thank you again. And I just want to say to our audience that on later in the month, most likely on May 24th, Helen Dory, the inspectress of the John Soane Museum, will be joining us to share the recently reopened drawing offices at the museum, which is where Soane's architects actually design buildings and learn how to sketch by copying fragments on the wall as the light came through them. It's a very interesting story, and the foundation helped to fund the restoration of that room, which we're very proud of. If any of you are in London, you should go see it. It is remarkable. When that work started, I kind of thought, what's the big deal? It looks great the way it is. But when you see it, and not only has it structurally been fortified, which is important, but also everything has been cleaned, and it looks remarkably fresh, and you see it with new eyes. And so please do go see it when that room's open. It's going to get a lot of great publicity, which we're really excited about. And so thank you all for joining us. And Bruce, did you want to add something about that?
About the drawing office?
The drawing office, right.
Well, we are going to be having over the summer and thereafter tours, but because it's a small space and you can have a maximum of 6 people at a time, you'll have to book through our website to do that. It'll be on Saturdays, I think. There'll be a tour each Saturday and maybe another day during the week. But definitely it was a great achievement. It's the last piece of the museum that was restored, and it's going to be renovated by the presence of an artist in residence each spring and each fall. And we are grateful to the foundation because their initial gift was the catalyst for raising the money to do all of this.
Wonderful. I think especially worthwhile, by the way, for architects and designers who work at a desk. It's interesting to go back and see how our architects worked in the early 19th century. Very exciting. So again, thanks everybody for joining us, and do join us again later in the month. Go to our website and find out the exact details for Helen Dory's talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Bye. Okay. How do I leave? Ah, okay.